If I go to this one, to this function says it would return a string. It's meant that whenever it is done, it has to return a string to us. That's not what we want to be doing. That would be the case in here. I want to say, when you do the multiplication, you return an integer value to us. What is the value? Most likely it is the value of the result. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say return what? The return result. So it basically says whenever you call this function is going to do some stuff in here. And at the end it must return an integer because this value is of the type integer return. If you don't have this by default, it's basically like this, which says you don't return anything. So having a void or not having it at all is exactly identical. It simply means nothing gets a return. But in this case, I don't want that. I actually want to return an integer. And now let's see how going to use it in my oncreate. I want you to think for a second as to what does this line of code actually mean. If you want, do for a second. Think about and then I'll explain what does it mean. So basically in here, if you put this function multiply or function 6 by 8, it means it will do this calculation, which is multiplying them together and we return. So in this case, 6 by 8, it would be 48. So this line of code is basically equivalent to putting this value right in the middle of your column. Is like writing 48 somewhere in the middle of your code, which isn't very meaningful. So you basically want to do things that you can actually wait for the results to come and do some calculation on that. For instance, I want to go ahead and say I have a value, let's call it m or let's call it output. For instance, I want to be of different names so they actually don't become confusing. I'm going to say the output is actually the value that this guy creates. So basically right now in this application, output is going to be 48. What do you do with that? It's something that we will see in the future. Or you can think of many ways of doing it. For instance, you can actually do this multiplication divisions and we see a far more complex matters in the future. So those are the basics of having functions that they don't take any arguments or they do take an argument and they do something. That functions, that they take multiple arguments and they take multiple arguments and they return something, or they could be functions that they don't take any arguments. They just returned values such as those that we use when we communicate with feedback. Not how do we use these kind of things, functions within our own classes. It's funny because right now you are actually writing functions on a class called the main activity. So that's exactly the way that we use them. So if you wanted to actually make it for a custom U class, let me show you how I would do that. Let me go up here. I'm going to make my previous class of the user. And this class of the user this time is only based on a name, doesn't have anything more complex in it. And I have a name which is the name that we received. And then also I'm going to have a function. So U function I'm going to go ahead and say in the function the user can do, for instance, this is a friend or not. So basically this function, when we call it, it has to tell us whether this user is friend or not. Now, how do we do that? Calculation is kind of irrelevant right now. But what I want you to think about is what kind of return should this one give us? The function that is supposed to find out if someone is a friend or not, what kind of return it should give us? I feel like the return of it should be a boolean. So it has to be a boolean value that runs. Some calculations are done, some calculations are done. It has to return a value for us. It has to either return false because the user is not my friend, or it has to return true, because the user is my friend, or any of those things. So right now, if you make a user, we can actually give you the name and then we can check for that value, even though this is not really going to do anything right now because we obviously don't know how to do those calculations. It still can be used correctly. So I'm going to go to my oncreate somewhere up here and then go ahead and say I want to have a user. So let's go ahead and say value Steve, that's going to be a user by the name Steve, the user then, and then go ahead and say on this Steve, just check if is friend or not. And we know this value always returns false right now. That is true. And we know that we are doing it statically without actually having any dynamic way of testing for values. It's always false. Right now, however, I want to think about here again. We have the same situation as we had with that number 48, simply because right in the middle of our code, we are writing what's right in the middle of uncreate. The result of this value would be false because it's always a cross, and that's not a good thing. However, I could do another thing. I could say, let's put this in a statement. So I'm going to say if Steve is a friend, then do this and then else do something else. What would be that case, for instance? A very simple one that you definitely have seen on social media. If a Steve is a friend, shake the friend box, otherwise leave the brand box empty. So this way we will know that if the user that we are searching for is a friend of us, we can actually see that the friend box of them is checked. Otherwise the phone box would be empty. So you can actually click on it and, for instance, request friendship or anything of the source. So this was a quick introduction as to how we use functions with arguments, with the task, how we use functions within our own classes and how do we call them and how do we use the results of them. Sometimes the results of them, they just do something for us that they don't have a return. Sometimes the returns of them, we actually put it in another variable because we want to do something with it. So let's keep it up to here. I want you to do a little bit of an exercise on your own, and that is writing a function for your user class that basically compares to users and tells you if these two are the same user. So, for instance, on your social media application, you are navigating between user and user, user, user. And right now you have ended up at a certain place with certain users. It is likely it's not impossible that this user is you yourself, because you could have been navigating through so many pages and you eventually ended up at yourself again. So we want to check for that. You want to know whether this user is me? So trying to find the function that compares to users and tells you whether those two users are the same, and I give you a little bit of a hint. Obviously, you have to find something that is unique between users. Names are not unique. So keep that in mind. So try to write that down once you're good and ready, and hopefully you can successfully. Let's move on to our next. Here to talk about more serious programming, they're looking to functions in this lesson. We use functions to execute a particular task. Among many other reasons, functions also can have input values and they could also have returns. So let's see all of these in practice. I'm going to head into Android Studio. I'm going to open a new application. I'm going to call it functions. Now, let's see how it functions. Actually do things for me once my application goes up. I started writing the most simple of the functions, and this is going to be a function called let's call it simple function. And the simple function is like that. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't take any arguments. It doesn't return anything. But it is a separate piece of code. Now, imagine you wanted to do this. Imagine you wanted to come to uncreate in your uncreate. You wanted to do something like a toast. So you basically wanted to say toast. And in the toast you want to say hi and then say this and then put it hi and then you wanted to show it. Now, if this is happening between the uncreate, what they could do is I could actually say let this happen within my simple function in here and run this simple function in my uncreate. So basically this way, I managed to organize my code. I said, well, whatever I want to happen, which is longer in here, in this case, 4 lines of code, is going to happen within this function, but you run that function within my uncreate. So that's like the most basics of having a function. However, there's other ways of doing this. There are functions that they can take in an argument or multiple arguments. Let's see how we can actually change this function to take that. Let me actually change these functions. Name I'm going to call it my function. So my function currently doesn't take in any arguments. Let's go ahead and say is going to take the value that we want to show in here. So this value API is a string. So if instead of that we have another thing, for instance, if I go ahead and say my string is going to be high and then I say toast is going to toast, this value obviously is going to still stay high. But the high is basically coming from this attribute of this variable, basically. So instead of that, I want to actually feed this from whoever is calling the function. So I'm going to say my function takes an argument. Let's say that argument is principal value, which is of the type a string. So whenever we call my function, we have to feed into value, add to it. So whoever is calling my function and it is showing me an error is saying that you haven't really given me what I need. It says no value passed for parameter value. So it's saying when you call this function, you have to feed a value of the type of string. I'm going to say that is going to be my name, or that's going to be the name of a city, for instance. Or whatever. That is my intention, as long as I know that value is going to be extremely valuable. So I feed that value into it, and whatever my function gets called, instead of always statically printing hi, I'm going to say you will do a toast or whatever you found in here, or let's call this one input value. I'm going to call this one in value. And I'm going to say every time my function is called, whatever we give into it, this function is going to pass that one to whatever body of the function it has. This part, we call it the body of the function. This is obviously the declaration of the function. This is the arguments of the function and this is the body of the function. And this function doesn't have any return type just yet. So we will see how we can actually function with return types in a second. So far we managed to have functions that these functions, they basically take in an argument and they do something that in this case they just toast it. But obviously we could do a lot more complex matters with them as well. Now, let's go ahead and write another function. This function is basically going to take two values and it's going to multiply them together and it's going to show me the result of it. I kind of leave this to you guys if you want. Pause the video in here, try it on your own and then come back to see my solution. Or if you want, just tag along with me and see what I'm doing. So my function, let's call it multiplier function. It basically is going to take two values. So I have to have two of these. So I'm going to say 5, which is going to be an integer, and m, which is going to be an integer. So if you have multiple arguments, you basically separate them by a comma. Let me put this sort of get to the here. So if you have multiple arguments, you basically separate them by a comma. I am integer, an integer. What do we want to happen? We want to multiply them together. So if you want to multiply two values, for instance, I multiply by m, you actually have to put this value in something because there's no point of multiplying. For instance, the fact that you multiply 3 by 6 by 4, you would tell me 3 by 4 is 12. You would say okay, 3 by 4 because this is that, meaning 3 by 4 without saying. So what happens is I'm going to go ahead and say its other value, let's call it the result, which is going to be I multiplied by ERM. So basically the result is the multiplication of these two values together. And for instance I want to actually show that. So I'm going to go ahead and say toast in the toast. I'm going to say in here, show us the value of results dot to a string, and don't worry about that, we'll come back to this towards the end of this section. This is a way to convert an integer to a string and going they show the result of that. So now I'm sure you can guess what's going to happen here. If I go in here and in my uncreate and I say multiplier function is going to say, well, give me two numbers. I'm going to say 6 and 8. So it's going to take 6. I was going to get 8. It's going to multiply 6 by 8. And it's going to become 48. And then it's going to say toast. Show me 48 basically. And this will be a return function with multiple arguments. And in this case it basically multiplies them together. There could be many other things that you might need to do. Now let's do another one in this other one. We want to actually take a value and multiply it by another value, and then we want to return that value. Keep in mind but what I mean by return right now, when we call the multiplier function, it basically does something. It shows it on the screen. But nothing from this function, from multiplying function, nothing basically comes back to my uncreate. What if I want to have a function that does a calculation and then returns that value to me? So doing that is actually rather simple. I'm actually going to get rid of this whole tosspot. I'm going to say this function, multiply a function at the end. I'm going to add the column and I'm going to say this function returns an integer, adding a column and a value type. It simply tells the function that what are you returning?